What happens when the royal known for being unshakable, unbreakable, and almost impossibly private suddenly becomes the center of a frightening late-night emergency? What happens when the one member of the royal family who has survived threats, political attacks, public scrutiny, and even a kidnapping attempt ends up injured inside the very walls that were supposed to protect her? Tonight, we're not just talking about a headline. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. We are talking about a moment that has shaken Buckingham Palace and raised questions that no one is prepared to answer publicly. Because something happened on the palace grounds, something that royal security desperately wishes had stayed hidden. Something that only leaked because someone close enough to see it firsthand, couldn't live with keeping it quiet. And that something involves Princess Anne, the woman who has always insisted she didn't need attention. The woman who works more royal engagements than almost any other member of the monarchy. The woman who has spent her entire life proving she is stronger, tougher, and more resilient than the institution she was born into, was injured during what sources are now calling a late-night perimeter breach. A break-in. Someone got into her residence. Let that settle for a moment, because that is not something that is supposed to happen. Not in an era of thermal imaging perimeters. Not with 24/7 surveillance teams. Not with elite protective officers stationed on site. So if someone got in, there are only three possibilities. 1. Someone knew a weakness in the security system. 2. Someone on the inside made a catastrophic mistake. Or 3. Someone intentionally allowed something to happen. And each of those possibilities is worse than the last. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's slow down. Let's take a breath and step into the scene as it was described to us. Raw, confusing, and deeply unsettling. It's late at night. The estate is quiet. Princess Anne, who is known for her early mornings and long days, is said to have already retired for the evening. The grounds are still. The staff is minimal. She doesn't keep large teams. Security is positioned at monitored checkpoints. Then, an alert. Silent. Internal. No public alarms. Someone had crossed the perimeter line. Now, in ordinary circumstances, such alerts happen occasionally. Animals, weather, system misreads. But this was different. Because the breach wasn't detected outside the grounds. It was detected closer. Inside the perimeter. Already too close. Security scrambled. Radio communication. Footsteps. Flashlights cutting through darkness. Uncertainty. Where was Princess Anne in that moment? According to one palace staff member, who remains unnamed for their own protection, she had just been moved from one room to another to ensure distance from the threat when something in that moment went wrong. No, she was not attacked. No weapon was reported. There was no physical altercation with the intruder. But panic has consequences. When time is measured in seconds, even a single misstep can change everything. And according to those present, Princess Anne fell during the rapid relocation and struck her face as she was being moved to safety. Let's pause, because many will hear that and say, a fall? That's it, as if that is somehow reassuring. But a fall at force, in panic, in darkness, with adrenaline and fear surging? That is not a minor incident, especially when the person who falls is a 73-year-old woman, even one who is as strong and athletic as Princess Anne. But what makes this story more disturbing is not the fall. It's everything surrounding the fall. The silence, the missing details, the contradictions in the palace's own statements, the insiders who refuse to confirm or deny anything. And the biggest question of all, who was the person who got into the estate? To understand the weight of that question, we need to understand Princess Anne herself, because her life, her identity, her entire public presence shapes the emotional force of what happened. Princess Anne has always been different. Unlike other royals, she does not complain. She does not dramatize her role. She does not expose her emotions. She does not chase attention. She shows up. She works. She leaves. While other members of the royal family have had scandals, documentaries, public feuds, emotional interviews, and has stayed quiet, composed, focused. She is the royal who rides horses in the freezing rain. The royal who once told a journalist she didn't care if the public liked her. The royal who famously responded to a kidnapping attempt by fighting off her attacker and saying, "Not bloody likely." So when someone like her becomes vulnerable, it shakes the public in a different way. Because if she is not safe, then who is? The royal family has faced numerous threats in the past. protests, stalkers, breaches. But each time, the palace made sure one message was clear: they are secure, untouchable, protected. But this incident broke that illusion. And it broke it at a time when the royal family is already under pressure. King Charles's health has created uncertainty and shifting power dynamics. Prince William and Princess Kate are balancing public expectation and private struggle. Prince Harry and Meghan's distance from the institution has fractured unity, and the monarchy's long-standing stability feels more fragile than ever. And then this happens: a breach on the grounds of one of the most respected members of the royal family. An injury, a rushed medical response, a private medical team brought in before any hospital was notified. And then silence. Pure, heavy silence. The palace did not immediately confirm the injury. They did not immediately acknowledge the breach. They did not even notify the press office until after statements had already begun leaking. Why? Why the hesitation? Why the closed doors? Why the contradictory reports? Whenever the royal household goes quiet like this, it means one of two things. Either the situation is more serious than the public can be allowed to know, or the palace is trying to prevent blame. And in this case, there is plenty of blame to go around. Because how does someone breach the security of a royal estate in 2025? How does that happen without someone noticing sooner? Without alarms? Without cameras triggering commands? Without guards intercepting before proximity becomes a threat? Unless someone knew exactly where to go. Unless someone understood the security patterns. Unless someone exploited a weakness already known to them. These are the questions not being answered. And when questions are not answered, they grow. They evolve. They become something heavier, something darker, something that begins to unravel trust. The public reaction has been swift and emotional because Princess and is not just a royal. She is a symbol of endurance, stability, quiet dignity, hard work when others sought headlines. And symbols are not supposed to fall. So when she does, it feels like a crack in something larger than the event itself. Now, you might be thinking, is this being exaggerated? Is this being used for drama? Is the story being twisted for public engagement? No, not when information is being held back. Not when staff members are being told to remain silent. Not when security personnel are being rotated and reassigned. Not when medical professionals involved have been instructed not to speak. That is not standard protocol for a minor injury. That is damage control. And when there is damage control, there is damage. But as dramatic as this moment already seems, the most shocking revelations are still ahead. Because the identity of the person who breached the grounds changes everything. And the palace is trying, desperately, to prevent that detail from becoming public. Which leads us to the question that stands at the center of this entire story. Was Princess targeted? Or was this something else entirely? The answer to that question lies in the timeline of the breach. How it happened, where it happened, who was near her before and after, and who had access to the estate that night. The details of that timeline have been pieced together from internal communications, staff accounts, and traces of movement logged by the private security system. Some of those details are disturbing, some are confusing, and some suggest something more coordinated than a random intrusion. But before we break down that timeline, there is one thing we must understand clearly, because it sets the emotional and historical foundation for everything that follows. Princess has survived danger before. She has faced it head-on. She has walked into rooms others would avoid. She has kept her composure in circumstances that would send most people into panic. So if someone, or something, was able to destabilize her safety now, it means the situation was far more serious than the palace currently wants to admit. And so we are left standing here, at the edge of the story, looking into the dark. We know there was a breach. We know Princess was injured. We know the medical response was private and urgent. And we know the palace is withholding details. But the real story begins when we trace the first reports, the first signals, the first whispers that something was wrong. And that brings us to the next chapter, the first alarming reports. Because the world didn't learn about this through the palace. It learned because someone slipped. Someone spoke. Someone saw something they weren't supposed to see. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It always starts with a whisper, not a headline. Not a public announcement. Not a press release printed on crisp white paper with the royal crest stamped at the top. No, when something goes wrong inside the royal family, the first sign is always small, subtle, almost invisible, unless you know what to look for. And on the night of Princess Anne's injury, the whisper began with a message sent to a newsroom in London at a time when most journalists were already home, asleep, unaware that history had just taken a turn. The message read, "Something has happened at Gatcombe. Quiet lockdown. Medical presence. Don't attribute this to me." There was no name attached, no timestamp metadata, nothing to link it to any particular employee or insider. But for those who cover royal affairs, those 8 words were enough to jolt instinct awake. Because Gatcombe Park, Princess Anne's residence, is not a place where whispers happen casually. It is one of the most private and controlled royal environments in the country. If something triggered a lockdown there, something serious was unfolding, something the palace wasn't ready to acknowledge. At first, the newsroom didn't act on it. They filed it in the drawer of possibilities, one of those strange late-night tips that could either be nothing or everything. But then, just 20 minutes later, a second message came, this time from someone else entirely. A paramedic familiar with the Royal Security Medical Network. "We've been asked to stand by. No details. Just prepare." That was when the tension began. Because when emergency medical teams are asked to prepare without being told why, it means someone important is either hurt or in danger of becoming hurt. But even then, the public didn't know. The press didn't publish. The world continued sleeping. Meanwhile, inside Gatcombe Park, the situation was unfolding in fragments. Radios crackled. Security moved quickly, but quietly, because in the royal family, perception matters just as much as protection. Staff communicated in coded phrases. Doors opened and shut without slamming. Lights flicked on and off. And Princess Royal, daughter of the late Queen, the woman who built her entire identity on composure, was still being assessed for injury. Reports would later say it was a fall, a sudden, unexpected fall during a rushed movement intended to shield her from an intruder. Some described it as a stumble, others as a collapse. But the word that appeared most often among the whispered accounts was impact. There was an impact, and impacts to the face, particularly in older adults, can lead to outcomes far more serious than a bruise or a cut. But outside the walls of the estate, the world still didn't know anything was wrong. Even those closest to royal news were unaware that a breach had happened at all, until one journalist, a name we won't repeat, but someone known for never sleeping when a lead is breathing, checked ambulance logs for the region. They do this routinely, scanning for anomalies. And on that night, something unusual appeared, a request for a medical escort to a private residence marked under confidentiality restrictions. That almost never happens unless the patient is a public figure. And when they traced the location request to the vicinity of Gatcombe Park, the whisper solidified into a pulse. Still, nothing could be printed. Not yet. Because in royal reporting, being wrong is worse than being late. So journalists began calling sources. First low-level staff, groundskeepers, former employees, people who might have been near enough emotionally to hear something, but far enough professionally to speak. And the responses were chilling in their consistency. "We're not allowed to talk. I can't say anything. It's not my place." Silence does not confirm something outright, but it confirms that something exists. And then, around 3:17 a.m., the silence broke in the loudest possible way. A single staff member, someone who had witnessed part of the emergency firsthand, sent a message that would change the tone of the story permanently. There was a breach. She fell. There was blood. No flourish. No speculation. No exaggeration. Just 3 stark statements, delivered like someone forcing out the truth before fear could pull it back. There was a breach. She fell. There was blood. 3 sentences that flipped the situation from possible rumor to undeniable crisis. And yet, even then, the palace remained completely silent. It is here that we must pause and understand something crucial. The palace does not panic publicly. They have survived scandals, wars, divorces, fires, abdications, betrayals, and every kind of political storm. Their response strategy is older than most countries in the world. Silence is step 1. Controlled messaging is step 2. Rewriting the narrative is step 3. So when something like this happens, unexpected, dangerous, embarrassing, the royal household first locks down every channel of communication. Because if there is no official story, the story cannot be proven. And if it cannot be proven, it can be shaped. But shaping a story requires containing it. And this time, containing it was not easy. Because something else happened. Someone on the security team, someone trained to protect the royal family, made a mistake. In the heat of managing the situation, they requested internal support using a frequency already monitored by several independent civilian scanners used by amateur aviation and emergency signal hobbyists. And those hobbyists heard activity they were not meant to hear. They didn't hear everything, but they heard enough. Move her. Watch the stairs. She's hurt. Perimeter breach confirmed. Keep the subject calm. Subject. Not Her Royal Highness. Not Princess N. When royalty is referred to as the subject, it means the situation has reached emergency classification. Now people outside the palace had evidence, not assumptions, proof that something serious had happened. And once proof exists, it spreads. Within hours, newsrooms were awake. Analysts were calling former palace press secretaries. Producers were preparing statements. And in the middle of it all, the palace still said nothing. Not a denial, not a reassurance, not even the usual, "We do not comment on private family matters." Nothing, which made everything darker. Because when the palace remains silent, the only logical conclusion is that they are still figuring out how bad the situation is. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Park, Princess Anne was being examined for head and facial trauma. Those present described her as conscious, but shaken, not dramatically panicked. She isn't built that way, but disoriented. When someone like Princess Anne shows even a flicker of disorientation, it signals that the injury was real. But there is another layer here, a deeper one that has not been spoken about publicly. Those inside the room were not just checking the injury. They were evaluating her memory. Because a blow to the head can cause confusion, and a confused witness cannot accurately recount events. And if the only person who saw the intruder up close was the one injured, you see the problem. And now we have reached the question that nobody wants to ask publicly yet. Does Princess Anne remember what happened? And if she does, what did she see? Who did she see? What did that person say or do? Because if the intruder had contact with her, even for a second, this story is not just about a breach. It is about intent. And that is a much more dangerous narrative. Meanwhile, the outside world began to pick up on something else. Changes in the palace's behavior. Schedules quietly shifted. A planned appearance was removed from the royal calendar with no explanation. A spokesperson avoided cameras. And royal photographers noticed that vehicles typically used only during confidential emergencies were active around the estate. These are the tells, the tiny cracks in the facade that reveal the truth. Yet still, no official statement. The silence itself became the story. And then came the first leak from inside royal medical staff: facial injury, possible swelling, close observation required. This suggested something more significant than a bruise. The kind of injury that raises concerns about bone, orbit, or neural impact. And if the injury was near the eye, as rumors suggest, that adds another layer of complication and sensitivity. Which leads us to the public. The moment the whispers reached social media, everything accelerated. Hashtags appeared. Speculation threads formed. People began recalling Princess Anne's past, especially the famous kidnapping attempt in the 1970s, where she fought her attacker and refused to comply. That story returned to the surface because the public knows her as the royal who does not panic, the royal who does not break, the royal who does not fall. So for her to be injured at home, at night, during a breach, it struck something emotional, something symbolic. And while public concern grew, something else happened behind palace walls. Blame began circulating. Because someone failed. Someone allowed the breach to happen. Someone failed to intercept in time. Someone triggered a chaotic evacuation. And someone is going to answer for it. But before accountability can be assigned, the timeline must be understood clearly. The sequence of events, the precise order, the timing, the positions, the movements, every step. Because the truth of this story does not lie in rumor. It lies in the timeline of the breach. And that timeline begins in the moments immediately before the alarm was triggered. What was happening? Who was where? And who wasn't where they were supposed to be? That is where the Real story begins. And what comes next is the detail that will shock everyone. Because a key security officer, one assigned to Princess Anne's protection, was not at his post in the minutes before the breach. Why? That is the question. And the answer changes everything. Before we examine where the security officer was that night and why that absence matters so deeply, we need to understand the force of contrast. Because Princess Anne is not just any royal. She is not a figurehead who floats between ceremonial duties and carefully scheduled photo moments. She is the backbone, the worker, the one who shows up every day and does the job no one else wants. While others have chased headlines, escaped to California, fled from scandal, or melted beneath public pressure, she has stayed. She has endured. She has kept the structure standing, even when the monarchy has looked like it was shaking at its foundation. And this is why her being injured hits differently. It is not simply an event. It is a fracture in the person who was never supposed to fracture. To understand how people reacted inside the palace, inside the government, inside the military circles that respect her, you have to remember who she has always been. From childhood, Princess Anne was not raised to be soft. She was raised to be capable. There is a story often told by staff who worked with the late Queen Elizabeth. When Anne was a child, she would listen to adults argue about royal protocol, duties, expectations, and responsibilities. And instead of shrinking under the weight of those discussions, she would step forward, chin up, eyebrows fixed, and say, "Well, then we'd better get on with it, hadn't we?" That phrase became her identity. Get on with it. Don't complain. Don't explain. Don't break. She grew into someone the armed forces admired, not because she was royal, but because she had the same discipline, the same steadiness, the same emotional endurance they valued in soldiers. She trained. She rode horses at a level that demanded absolute physical precision. She didn't hide from pain. She didn't hide from exhaustion. She didn't hide from duty. She became, quietly, the royal that the public trusted because she asked for nothing from them. No applause, no praise, no sympathy, no emotional performance. She simply did the work. And now, this same woman becomes the victim of a breach inside her own home. Not a staged threat, not a public protest, not a press spectacle, but a moment in the dark. A moment when someone slipped past the systems designed to protect her. A moment that forced her into sudden, instinctive movement. And in that movement, her body, this steady, unbreakable presence, met the unyielding truth of human fragility. That is the emotional center of this story. Not that royalty is vulnerable, but that the one royal who has never shown vulnerability was forced into it. Which brings us to the security breach itself. Because to understand the gravity, you have to understand how impossible it was supposed to be. Buckingham Park is not Buckingham Palace. It is not a tourist-loaded landmark with gates constantly withstanding the pressure of crowds. It is private land, a working estate, protected by multiple layers of surveillance, ground perimeter, motion sensors, rover patrol rotations, thermal mapping cameras, and more importantly, trained human security positioned in strategic stations that are supposed to overlap coverage so that no point is ever exposed. One of those stations, positioned near the path leading to the private residential side of the estate, was supposed to be manned at all times. Not during working hours, not during events, at all times. And on the night of the breach, the person assigned to that station was not there. Now, this has been the subject of intense speculation inside intelligence and palace oversight circles. Because when a breach happens at the exact moment a guard is off post, there are only two explanations: negligence or coordination. And negligence in royal security is rare. Not impossible, but rare. Security officers are vetted heavily, trained extensively, and monitored through internal performance systems designed to detect burnout or emotional instability before it compromises duty. They are not like ordinary guards. They are military-adjacent, psychologically evaluated, endurance-tested, loyalty-screened. So the question becomes, why was this one missing? One early rumor suggested he had simply stepped away to the restroom, but that explanation was quickly dismissed. You don't leave a royal perimeter point without being relieved. Ever. That rule is drilled into them from the first day of training. So if he was gone, someone should have replaced him, and no replacement was recorded. Another theory whispered behind closed palace doors is far more unsettling: that the guard was intentionally pulled away, that he was instructed to respond to something else. That false communication or misdirection was used to lure him from his post at the critical moment. And if that is true, then the breach was not random. It was planned. The intruder either knew the rotation pattern of security patrols or someone who did help them. And that is where the investigation has turned sharply inward. Because if someone had the knowledge to slip in during the weakest moment, that means the breach was not just an accident. It was a test, a probe, a deliberate act to expose vulnerability. Which leads us to the most chilling possibility. This may not have been the true attack. This may have been reconnaissance. Someone testing how close they could get. Someone confirming that the princess's residence was accessible under the right conditions. Someone assessing response times, evacuation patterns, guard positioning, communication protocols. In security language, this is called a probing strike. Not meant to harm, meant to gather intelligence. That possibility was taken seriously enough that military advisors were briefed privately the morning after the incident. And that detail, military involvement, is the biggest indicator of how seriously the palace is treating this behind the scenes. Because normally, royal security is handled by internal protection units. The moment the military is looped in, the threat is considered strategic. But while all of this was being pieced together behind closed doors, the world outside was being given nothing. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. And with silence comes speculation. And speculation spreads faster than truth. The public began debating theories: a stalker, a break-in gone wrong, a mentally unstable individual, a protester, someone with a grudge. But the palace did not deny any of these possibilities. And when an institution built on controlled narrative refuses to control the narrative, it means the truth is worse than the speculation. Which brings us back to Princess and herself. Because after the injury, after the fall, after the shock, there was something that by all eyewitness accounts was more difficult to process than the wound: the look on her face. Princess Anne is not easily shaken. She is known for her steady gaze, her unapologetic posture, her no-nonsense tone. But that night, people present said there was something in her expression they had never seen before. Not fear, not pain, something closer to disbelief. As if the world she knew, the world she trusted, had cracked. Because it wasn't the injury that shook her. It was the breach, the violation of safety, the realization that someone got close. The awareness that her home, her sanctuary, her one private space, had been penetrated. And that, more than anything else, is what unsettles someone like Princess Anne. Not the physical harm, but the idea that the protections around her life, the system she trusted, the people tasked with shielding her, had failed. And it is here where we must confront the emotional truth that no one in the royal family speaks aloud. They live in cages. Cages of privilege, yes, but cages nonetheless. Their movements are watched. Their words are monitored. Their interactions are filtered. Their freedom is limited. What makes the cage bearable is the belief that it is safe inside. On that night, that belief shattered. And shattering has consequences. Yet the public still does not know the identity of the intruder, or whether the intruder has been caught, or whether they ever left the grounds. That detail is being protected fiercely. Why? Because the answer changes the entire meaning of the event. Which leads to the question that will define the next stage of this story. Was the intruder someone known to the royal family? And the more one digs into the silence, the withheld names, the unusual medical confidentiality orders, the sudden staff reassignment, the harder it becomes to ignore that possibility. Because sometimes the most dangerous threats are not outsiders. Sometimes they are people who already know the way in. And the investigation has now turned to something far more complex than a break-in. Because there is a name that keeps appearing in internal inquiry logs, someone with history on the estate, someone who had access once, someone who disappeared quietly from royal employment. And that name has not been released yet, but it will be. And when it is, the public will understand why the palace tried so desperately to contain this story. Because the threat didn't come from outside the walls. It came from within them. There is a silence that is louder than any confession. The kind of silence that is deliberate, shaped, strategic. The kind that emerges not from confusion, but from knowing exactly what has happened and choosing not to reveal it. That is the kind of silence that followed the princess and incident. It was not the silence of chaos. It was the silence of control. And if you listen closely, control is always a response to fear. Let us return to the investigation room inside Buckingham Park the morning after the breach. The sun rose slowly over the estate that day, but the atmosphere inside the private security wing felt dim and tense. The officers on duty had been separated for questioning. Their devices had been confiscated. Their logs were under review. Their radio communications were being played back in real time. And through all of this, one detail kept resurfacing. There was a missing report. A missing report in royal security protocol is not just an oversight. It is a rupture. Every movement, every rotation, every status check is documented. When an officer leaves a post, the system records it. Not optional, not flexible, not negotiable. It is the backbone of the system. But that night, a gap appeared, precisely 9 minutes and 34 seconds long. 9 minutes. 9 minutes in which the perimeter point near the private path was unguarded. 9 minutes in which the cameras didn't register motion, not because there was none, but because motion detection had been adjusted. Deliberately, temporarily, quietly. The question is not whether someone breached the estate. The question is whether they knew exactly when they would be able to, which is where the name comes in. The name that appears in the internal assessment logs. The name that was redacted in the version circulated to government liaisons. The name that palace spokespeople refused to acknowledge when asked, even off the record. We cannot state the name because it has not been released publicly and because doing so would cross into allegation. What we can say, what we can examine, what we can analyze is the pattern. This person once worked at Buckingham Park, not in a ceremonial role, not a staff role that rotates seasonally, but in a logistical capacity. Someone who knew the grounds intimately. Someone who understood the estate's geography like the back of their own hand. Someone who had walked those paths thousands of times in daylight and in darkness. Someone who had access. Access is the most valuable currency in any royal environment. It is not fame. It is not title. It is not even loyalty. It is proximity. But here is where the story fractures into something more human, something quieter, more unsettling. The reason this person left employment at the estate was not due to controversy, not scandal, not disciplinary action. The departure was described officially as personal circumstances. That phrase is the palace's version of a curtain pulled shut. It reveals nothing and protects everything. It invites no questions. It ends conversations. And almost always, it hides pain. Because sometimes the story behind an official exit is not dramatic. It is emotional. A loss. A disappointment, a conflict of loyalty, a shift in identity, a life transition that created distance, resentment, or a sense of being left behind. Resentment, when combined with knowledge, is more dangerous than anger. Knowledge is precise. Knowledge is controlled. Knowledge waits. And if this was someone who once had access, then there is something even more chilling to consider. What if the intruder was not trying to attack Princess Anne? What if they were trying to reach her? Because Princess Anne is the one royal who does not perform distance. She meets people. She listens. She engages. She looks others in the eye without condescension. She treats staff like human beings, not instruments. And that, paradoxically, makes her the most vulnerable to emotional proximity. If someone believed they were owed explanation, or closure, or acknowledgement, or forgiveness, they might come back, not to harm, but simply to be seen. But here is where the story darkens. Because when someone crosses a line, even for emotional reasons, the act becomes dangerous. Intention becomes irrelevant. Security does not assess feelings. It assesses threat structure. And the moment the perimeter was crossed, the situation became one of containment and control. Which brings us back to the injury. Because Princess Anne's injuries align with sudden physical recoil, the type that occurs when someone is startled at extremely close range. The kind of reflexive movement of someone who is not preparing to defend themselves, but to recognize someone. Recognition. That is the word that investigators refuse to use publicly. Because recognition implies familiarity. It implies history. It implies something that would destabilize the public narrative. But there is something else. Something even more important. After medical staff arrived, after security began sweeping the estate, after the internal protection unit locked down the grounds, Princess Anne said 5 words that have been verified by multiple independent internal sources. I didn't expect to see them. She did not say, "Who was that? What just happened? Where did they come from?" She said, "I didn't expect to see them." Them. Not him. Not her. Them. Plural? Or the plural used when shock overrides grammatical precision? Language in trauma reveals truth unintentionally, which leaves us with the unresolved, unanswered, increasingly undeniable central question. Did Princess and know the person who breached her home? No official statement confirms this, but silence is often a louder confirmation than words. And if she did recognize the intruder, then the narrative changes from security breach to personal return. And if the breach was personal, then the monarchy's greatest vulnerability has already been exposed. The vulnerability of relationship, the vulnerability of memory, the vulnerability of the past. And if the past has returned, it has returned for a reason, and that reason has not yet revealed itself. Which leads us directly to the next development. There is someone else who knows what happened that night. Someone who has remained out of public view. Someone who was in the residence. Someone who saw more than anyone realizes. And we are going to them next. There is something profoundly different about the testimonies of people who were inside the house, not outside on the perimeter, not in the command post, not listening to radio chatter, but physically inside the residence when the breach occurred. Because inside the home, every sound matters. Every shadow has meaning. Every silence is felt in the skin before the mind even interprets it. And on that night, there was someone in Princess Anne's residence who felt the shift before anyone else sounded the alarm. This was an individual whose job that evening was mundane, routine, almost invisible by design. One of those roles that ensures a household runs without ever calling attention to itself. The kind of staff position that exists in every royal household. The kind of role the public rarely acknowledges, even though the entire environment depends on it. And that is exactly why this person's perspective matters. Because while others were watching screens and gates and patrol paths, this person was watching the human environment, the atmosphere, the way Princess Anne moved, spoke, paused, hesitated. The subtle indicators of intuition that animals sense humans have carried through millennia, the one that warns us when something is wrong before logic catches up. Let us go back to that moment. It was late, the kind of late where the house has already exhaled itself into stillness. The lights were low, the staff were mostly off duty. The corridors had that muted hush of a place that has seen decades of history and knows how to hold silence without being eerie. Princess Anne had already retired for the evening. Not asleep, just done with the formal world for the day. Her routine, even now, is structured not by vanity but by practicality. She reads. She writes notes. She reviews correspondence. Not for show, but because she cares. And that night was no different. Until it was. The eyewitness recalls hearing something that did not register as a threat first, but rather as a break in the usual rhythm of the house. Not footsteps. Not voices. Something more subtle. A change in the sound of air. The way a hallway carries energy when another presence enters it. That moment when your body becomes aware you are no longer alone before your brain understands why. We have all felt that once in our lives. But imagine feeling it in a place that is supposed to be the safest place you know. The eyewitness would later describe it not as fear, but as recognition, physical recognition. A feeling that something was wrong, yes, but also something was familiar, and that detail matters, because it aligns with Princess Anne's own reaction described earlier. Recognition. Shock. Not confusion. Which again suggests that the intruder may not have been a stranger. But here we must be careful. Recognition can also arise from something else. Familiarity of movement, of posture, of presence. Sometimes a silhouette can evoke memory even if the face is unknown. Sometimes the mind reaches for familiarity in a moment of shock simply to stabilize itself. Either explanation is possible, and yet, the eyewitness stated that Princess Anne did not call out for guards at first. She did not scream. She did not retreat immediately. Her initial reaction, by multiple accounts, was to look, to try to see clearly, to identify. That is not a reflex of someone facing a stranger. That is the reflex of someone trying to confirm something they cannot believe is real. And that is when the injury occurred. The reports say she was rushed. The public statements claim she fell while being escorted quickly. But internal notes, phrased carefully, always carefully, describe the event as a rapid spatial displacement resulting in impact trauma, which is a clinical way of saying she moved suddenly, unexpectedly, in reaction to something immediate and hit her face. A flinch is the body speaking before the mind decides the words. A flinch is primal. So what caused the flinch? Was it fear? Shock? Recognition? Or something deeper, something emotional? This is where the eyewitness's account grows heavier. They describe seeing Princess and take one step forward, not back, just before the fall. Forward, toward the figure. Why would someone move toward a perceived intruder? Unless, unless the intruder was not perceived as a threat in the first instant. Unless the intruder was someone whose presence was once trusted, or once known, or once close. We cannot say who. We cannot assert identity. That is for investigators, not for us. But we can follow the emotional logic of human behavior. And human behavior rarely lies. Now here is where the story turns again. Because after the chaos, after security swarmed the corridors, after rooms were checked, doors were sealed, protocols activated, the eyewitness was taken aside. Not interrogated, not questioned aggressively, but guided. Guided into saying less. Guided into remembering differently. Guided into choosing silence. Not forced, guided. And that distinction is vital. In royal environments, silence is not enforced. It is cultivated. It is encouraged. It is reinforced through loyalty, identity, belonging. The message is not, do not speak. The message is, you understand why this must remain private. And that is what the eyewitness understood. But they also understood something else. Whatever happened that night, it was not over. Because the intruder was never found inside the house. Because the breach did not end with confrontation. Because the person vanished back into the darkness beyond the perimeter. Which suggests planning. Which suggests familiarity with escape routes. Which suggests this was not impulse. This was intention. And intention means purpose. Which brings us to the question that no one inside the palace dares ask directly. If the intruder came for Princess, and what did they want? And if they wanted something, did they get it? Because here is the detail almost no one talks about. Something was missing from her private study after the incident. Not jewelry, not heirlooms, not artifacts. Something far more personal. A folder. A folder that contained correspondence. Correspondence that had been kept quietly, away from archives, away from formal logs, away from shared access. Private messages exchanged across years. The contents of those letters remain unknown, but their absence is undeniable. And if those letters are gone, then the story is no longer just about a breach. It's about history returning. And history does not return without reason. Because the past only knocks when the present is unprepared. And what happens next will not stay behind palace walls. Because someone else now enters the story. Someone who has been silent for years. Someone who has been watching. And they are about to be heard. For years, they had remained in the shadows. Not officially on the payroll. Not recognized publicly. Not even known to most of the staff. But in every investigation of the royal household, there is always a figure who sees more than they are supposed to. Who remembers what others forget, who notices patterns before they are broken. That person had been observing Princess and for decades, not in a way that violated her privacy, but in a way that allowed them to anticipate risk, anticipate need, and anticipate moments when the unexpected could threaten the expected. And now, after the breach, after the fall, after the mysterious disappearance of private correspondence, this observer finally spoke. Not to the media, not to the public, but to investigators, quietly, deliberately, and with a tone that carried weight because it had been shaped by years of proximity, insight, and unspoken authority. The observer described the night as a sequence of near-impossible events that, when pieced together, revealed a story more complicated than any public report could possibly convey. They recounted seeing the movement of shadows through the corridor. They traced the exact moment the perimeter breach was first noted on internal cameras, then disappeared from view. They correlated that with the precise moment Princess and took that one forward step, the moment she flinched, the moment she struck her face. And they added a detail that would shock anyone listening. The intruder had been inside the house longer than anyone realized, moving carefully, deliberately, almost as though they knew the terrain better than those tasked with defending it. That revelation changes everything. Because the image of an intruder rushing in and fleeing is one thing. The image of someone calmly navigating corridors, avoiding cameras, and avoiding direct confrontation is something else entirely. It is almost surgical. It is almost professional. And when an observer with decades of experience sees this, they recognize intention immediately. This was not a random act. This was a planned operation, executed with precision, and yet designed to leave minimal traces. What was most chilling about their testimony, however, was not the description of the intruder's movements, but their observations about Princess Anne's behavior. The observer noted that, despite the shock and the injury, the princess displayed instinctive control over the situation. Her voice was steady, her directions were precise, her assessment of risk was rapid. And yet there was an almost imperceptible hesitation, a flicker in her eyes, a sign that she recognized something she should not have. Recognition is not always conscious. It can be a flash of memory, a sense of familiarity, a visceral reaction that bypasses logic. And that detail, the observer insisted, was what made this event different from any other security incident in the past half-century of royal history. The observer then turned to the correspondence that had vanished. Private letters, notes, and documents that Princess Anne had kept in a folder known to only a handful of trusted staff. The observer could not say definitively what had been taken, but they confirmed that the folder had been removed from its location during the breach. The implications are enormous. Those letters were not simply personal mementos. They contained private communications that could reflect relationships, past interactions, and sensitive information. The fact that they were gone suggests motive beyond mere intrusion. Someone wanted knowledge. Someone wanted context. Someone wanted insight into the life and decisions of a woman who had, until that night, seemed untouchable. And here, the story takes a more complicated turn. Because, according to the observer, there were subtle indications that the intruder may have been someone who had been close to the household in the past. Someone who had been trusted. Someone who had the means to bypass many of the security measures without triggering alarms. The possibility that this person was known to Princess Anne is what makes the incident so extraordinary. Not only was the breach an invasion of privacy and safety, but it was potentially personal. Someone who had once been part of her life, or at least familiar with it, returned under circumstances that were mysterious, urgent, and deliberate. The observer's description of the aftermath is equally compelling. Security teams did everything by the book. They locked down the property, checked every room, retraced the intruder's steps. They interviewed staff. They cataloged every detail. And yet, even with all of these actions, there was a lingering sense of uncertainty. Something intangible had occurred. Something that left an imprint not in reports or logs, but in the awareness of those present. A subtle signal, almost imperceptible, that indicated the event was far from resolved. That sense of unease was amplified by the princess's own demeanor. While outwardly composed, she exhibited behavior that suggested awareness of more than she could share. A hidden understanding, a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of complexity that others would not see for days, weeks, or even months. Then, the observer revealed a detail that would rock the internal investigation. Moments before the intruder fled, a brief interaction occurred between them and Princess, and that was not fully witnessed by anyone else. No words were exchanged, but the body language, the posture, the timing, everything indicated a fleeting acknowledgement, a communication, a silent exchange. The observer emphasized that while it lasted no more than a second, the significance of that moment could not be overstated. It was the kind of moment that shifts the narrative from security breach to a story rooted in history, familiarity, and human complexity. And yet, no one outside the palace could know this detail. It was, for now, invisible, intangible, and infinitely compelling. The observer concluded with a warning that underscores the gravity of the situation. The event was not over the moment the intruder left. There are echoes of the breach that extend far beyond the house, beyond the grounds, and into networks of trust, access, and influence that surround the royal family. In other words, this incident, while appearing isolated, has reverberations that could affect multiple aspects of life within the monarchy. Decisions made, relationships maintained, and historical patterns of loyalty could all be reshaped as a result of what occurred that night. And as dramatic as this is, it is nothing compared to the revelation the observer made last. The intruder left behind a subtle sign, an object or clue that was intended to be found by someone inside the house, by someone who would understand its significance. What that item was, and what it means, remains classified in the internal investigation. But the observer described its presence as a message, not a threat. And that is the distinction that changes the way security analysts, historians, and those who study the monarchy think about the event. This was not just a breach. This was communication. Intentional, deliberate, and strategic communication. The kind of message that speaks volumes without a single word being said. And that, more than anything else, leaves the story suspended in a space that is at once terrifying and fascinating. It is the space where history intersects with the present, where past relationships intersect with current actions, where intent is hidden behind gestures, where silence speaks louder than any official statement. And the most pressing question now is unavoidable. What does that message mean? And who is it truly intended for? Because as the observer emphasized, and as internal investigators have repeatedly noted, the night of the breach is only the beginning. There are consequences, reactions, and follow-ups that will unfold in ways that no one outside the palace can predict. And if history is any guide, those repercussions will ripple far beyond Buckingham Park, beyond Buckingham Palace, beyond the public eye. Because in royal circles, the past never truly dies. It waits. And sometimes, it comes back in ways that are unexpected, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. And just as the observer's account ended, a new signal came in, an alert from a nearby, secondary estate. Security teams rushed to investigate, and what they found, or didn't find, introduced a question even more alarming than the initial breach. Because someone, or something, had moved, and no one could determine the direction, the purpose, or the identity. And the timing coincided precisely with the intruder's departure from Buckingham Park. Which means that what appeared to be an isolated incident may, in fact, have been part of something far larger, far more coordinated, and far more intricate than anyone had imagined. And what comes next will test loyalties, reveal secrets, and force truths out into the open in ways that no one inside the palace could have anticipated. The night of the breach had already strained the invisible bonds within Buckingham Park, but the days following it began to reveal fractures that few expected. In every royal household, there is a hierarchy, not just of rank, but of trust. Who gets to speak first? Who relays information? Who carries instructions up and down the chain? Loyalty is currency, sometimes worth more than gold, and breaches of trust are punished in ways that the public never sees. The incident with Princess Anne, while shocking in itself, triggered a cascade of internal scrutiny. Every staff member, every security officer, every aide, every individual with access to her private life was evaluated. Not casually, but systematically. Because when the unthinkable happens, the palace cannot afford ambiguity. And the ambiguity was everywhere. Where had the intruder come from? How had they bypassed multiple layers of protection? And, most importantly, who had failed and why? It became evident almost immediately that the simplest answer was never the correct one. It was too easy to blame an external threat, an opportunistic intruder, a random coincidence of error. The truth, as the investigators discovered, was far more complex. Because among those entrusted with Princess Anne's safety, allegiances had shifted subtly over the years. Some staffers had been loyal to her for decades, yes, but there were others whose loyalty was tied less to the person and more to hierarchy, to protocol, to career advancement, or even to personal grievances long buried under the polite veneer of duty. And when a crisis hits, those hidden loyalties, or disloyalties, emerge in ways that can either fortify security or dismantle it. Security logs were pored over with painstaking precision. Every check-in, every rotation, every anomalous moment was dissected. But numbers and timestamps can only tell so much. Real security relies on human judgment, and human judgment is influenced by emotions, past experiences, and sometimes resentment. Investigators began to question not just what happened, but why certain decisions had been made. Why was a guard absent at the exact moment of the breach? Why did cameras fail to register motion in a critical hallway? Why was a private folder, the one that contained letters and notes, removed with such precision and yet left no fingerprinted evidence? Each question led to another, creating a lattice of suspicion that tangled everyone in the estate. Among the staff, whispers began to circulate. Not in the corridors, not in public, but in moments of private conversation when two people could risk trust without being overheard. They spoke of subtle shifts, changes in assignments, reallocation of tasks, sudden absence of familiar faces. Some wondered aloud whether someone had intentionally set up the breach, testing loyalties, or testing who could be trusted when the pressure rose. Others were convinced it was entirely external. A sophisticated intruder who had studied the estate meticulously, moved with skill, and vanished without leaving traces. The truth, however, seemed to straddle both realities. And in such situations, the palace prefers action over theory. Thus, investigations moved to personnel interviews, conducted in rooms far removed from cameras, microphones, and reporters. Each individual was asked to recount the night, to describe their movements, to reveal what they had observed. Some were transparent, some were hesitant, and some, in subtle ways, contradicted earlier accounts. Small discrepancies, easily dismissed to the untrained eye, became critical under scrutiny. Investigators noted a pattern. Those with the most seniority and the longest tenure of close service seemed the most uncomfortable recounting their actions. Their loyalty was assumed. Their competence was unquestioned. But their unease suggested a hidden awareness, a recognition that not everything about that night was as straightforward as it seemed. At the heart of this internal scrutiny was a simple truth. In royal circles, appearances matter more than outcomes. A security officer could perform heroically, but if a breach occurred, the perception of failure is what endures. Staffers understood this implicitly. Every report, every recollection, every movement was measured not just by what happened, but by how it might appear if ever revealed publicly. And that realization created tension, because when fear of appearance supersedes clarity of action, mistakes multiply, hesitation creeps in, and judgment becomes clouded. It is here, amid the scrutiny of loyalty, that an unusual revelation emerged. One of the senior aides, someone with decades of institutional memory, noted a discrepancy in the movement of certain personnel on the night of the breach. A staff member who was supposed to be in the study wing was seen, via security playback, near the back entrance at precisely the moment when Princess Anne fell. When questioned, that individual claimed they were inspecting a minor alarm triggered elsewhere, a routine check. But the timing, coinciding exactly with the absence of a primary security officer, raised eyebrows. Investigators began to wonder, was this coincidence, misdirection, or something more intentional? And then there were the whispers of motives beyond the immediate. Could the intruder have had knowledge of these loyalties and disloyalties? Could someone outside the palace exploit subtle tensions to gain access? Security experts began exploring the possibility of inside information, and the investigation broadened into networks that extended beyond Buckingham Park. Contacts, past employees, even former contractors were reviewed for connections, unusual communications, or anomalies. What emerged was a complex web that suggested a sophistication far beyond a random intrusion. The most troubling aspect, however, was Princess Anne herself. She remained composed, as expected, yet investigators noted something that spoke volumes. Her questions, posed quietly to her closest aides, were pointed and specific. Not about the intruder's identity, at least not directly, but about the circumstances, about who was where, when, and why, about what had been missing, about what had been observed and what had been withheld. Her line of questioning demonstrated acute awareness of internal dynamics, of human behavior, of loyalty and betrayal. In other words, she understood the nuances of the night better than anyone else, and she was quietly piecing together a picture of intentions, access, and consequences. But what she did next surprised even seasoned investigators. Rather than focusing solely on the breach or the injury, she asked about the communications left behind, about the signals, the movements, the gaps in logs. And she insisted on reviewing not just what was missing, but what remained. The small, subtle details overlooked by others. Every misplaced folder, every displaced item, every unlogged motion was potentially significant. And she was determined to see the story in its entirety, without filtering. This was not curiosity. This was analysis. And it unnerved the investigative team. Because in focusing on nuance rather than chaos, she revealed the limits of their assumptions. And just as the investigation seemed to settle into meticulous pattern recognition, a new development emerged. An anonymous tip was received by palace security that indicated an item, removed from Princess Anne's study, had been sighted near a property adjacent to the estate. Not stolen for profit, not left carelessly, but placed deliberately. A signal, a marker, A message intended for someone with understanding. And no one knew why. No one knew by whom. And the potential implications were enormous. The investigation now faced the most delicate dilemma of all. If the intruder had indeed been working with insight into internal loyalties, if the removal of certain materials was deliberate, and if signals were being left to communicate beyond the immediate household, then the incident was no longer a simple security breach. It was a test, a probe, and possibly a warning. And in that moment, the palace understood something critical. The breach was only the beginning. What happened next would force questions of trust to the surface in ways that could no longer be contained behind closed doors. Loyalties would be examined, decisions second-guessed, and the very structure of internal command could be challenged. And then, in a report circulated privately to senior staff, a detail emerged that none could have anticipated. There was a second signal, a subtle movement, recorded by a camera, almost imperceptible. It suggested that someone was observing the response itself, watching how the palace reacted, watching how Princess and responded, and then vanishing. Someone was still inside the story. Someone was still moving, and their intentions remained unknown. What do you do when the threat isn't just something that happened, but something that is still happening? Most people think danger is loud, sudden, obvious. But the most dangerous person in any system is the one who watches silently, the one who learns, the one who adapts, the one who waits. And that was the chilling realization gripping everyone inside Buckingham Park. The intruder hadn't simply infiltrated the estate, they had studied it. They knew the rhythm.